I'm very glad to be able to speak to you for a few minutes about this very interesting uh, and very engaging book, I have to say. It's
Thank you, Mark. It's an honor for me. It's a privilege.
you start your book with an anecdote about a Turkish word. Actually, Turkish is one of your languages, uh, and the Turkish word is yakamos. What is the anecdote?
Yeah, so when I was in my teenage years, I was visiting my family in Turkey, and we were again sitting at a restaurant by the sea. And my aunt pointed at the sea and said to me, "Look, Kübra, at how bright the Yakamos is shining." And I followed her gaze and I was trying to see what she was pointing at, but to me it was just darkness, and I didn't see like I was looking for something bright and light, a sort of light coming from the water.
Yeah.
And I couldn't see that. So I asked her again, and she explained again, and it went back and forth until my parents sort of laughed and intervened and explained to me that Yakamas describes the reflection of the moonlight in the water, in the sea. And that was the first time I realized I first saw it, but I also realized that because I was missing this word, I wasn't able to see things the way my aunt saw it or my parents saw it. And that to me was like sort of a light bulb going on in my head, but also understanding and realizing how much darkness there was, how many things there were that I was missing out on. And throughout my life, I've had many of these anecdotes that sort of showed to me how beautiful language is, but also how much I was missing out on because of the things that I wasn't able to translate in the other languages I was speaking, and how difficult it was to try and be when you occupy and live in various languages.
Yeah. At the same time, you can say this is also a treasure in itself, right? So because you can actually, if you would be monolingual German in your case, well, there would be no way of ever getting in touch with this concept of Jacomos or something. You say at some point in your book, you say something like, so you mention, I guess, the four languages which are most important to you, and then you say Turkish for me is the language of love and melancholy, I believe, and
Yes.
Arabic is the language of mysticism and spirituality, and German is the language of intellect and but also of desire, and English is the language of freedom,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I said that. I wrote that in the book, and something very interesting happened because after I had published the book and many interviews, I was asked exactly around this quote, and the interviewers wanted me to retell what I was sort of what I wrote there. But I realized after I'd written the book, it wasn't true anymore because before I wrote the book or while I was writing the book, I was still sort of trying to find my way within language, within the languages I was speaking, and also always trying to understand how can you exist in a language you were not meant to exist in. How can you exist in a language that you were not supposed to speak in but be spoken about? And this sort of struggle was obviously one that I wasn't the first to discover or try to fight, but thousands before me, thousands while I was trying to find out how to solve this, and thousands after me, or maybe millions, I don't know. And so I was trying to answer these questions, and while I was writing this book, what I wrote was true. I've had this very strong connections to each language. Turkish was the language I was first loved in, that I first loved back in, the love to my parents. And so there were these really strong connections. But after I had finished the book, I had come to truly understand, something had sunk in that I had intellectually understood. And that was a quote, I'm paraphrasing, by James Baldwin, an Afro-American writer who in the 60s, Black man, homosexual man in the 60s, you just have to sort of go back in time to the 60s, how it was like to be a Black homosexual man in the US. He went to Paris. It was a sort of self-imposed exile he was in. And he asked the very same questions. And the answer he gave blew my mind. And that was, he said, he was describing his very difficult relationship to the English language. And the essay is called Why I Stopped Hating Shakespeare. And in this essay, he writes about his struggle with the English language because it did not have the words that he needed to explain, as a writer, the experiences he was having, the perspectives he was occupying, and the lack of words to carry the weight of his experience made him struggle with this language. And then he wrote, yes, it may be the fault of the language that it doesn't carry the weight of my experiences, but, he wrote, it might also be my fault, because I've never learned to use language, but I've merely learned to copy it. And that distinction between using language and imitating language, this very small but distinct line of difference, has a massive effect. And what this truly meant, I only understood after I'd written the book, because with writing this performative book, a book that I was not supposed to write, not with the positionality I have within society, it's an audacious book in some sense. I had tried to do something that only in retrospect I understand as having done something I wasn't supposed to do in a performative way that freed me, and that is to use language, to take the courage to use language. Baldwin wrote that it will take courage, it will take a lot of effort and work to put the weight of your experience into language by using it and not imitating it. And he says maybe through that work, at one point, he might be able to truly be in the language. And it was only after I had written and published the book, it was only when I was interviewed that I realized that I had now truly understood it.
Yeah. So this changed your, maybe not even your attitude, but your way of being, in your case, I guess, especially in the German language, right?
Any language, actually. I understood that if I take the effort, the time, the courage, the thorough work that is necessary to learn a language in a way that you can truly play with it and use it and, engage with the messiness of language, that you may reach a point where you can be in a language. And actually, this also serves as a metaphor for so many other parts of life as well. There is a certain stage of life, and I think this stage comes again and again and again, and it's not something you answer for good at some point in your life. But I think to truly ask yourself, how much of what I'm doing and practicing in every aspect of my life, how much of that is imitating, how much of that is actually using the resources I have, whether it's from how we consume, how we are in relationships of love, of friendship, of family, of wider circles, the knowledge we have within our work, the tools we have within work, but also outside of work, how we have been taught how to be a citizen, how we have been taught how to be a human being, how much of that is an imitation and how much of that is actually us using our knowledge. Because if you reach a point of being able to make that distinction between using and imitation, you are so free, because all of the resources you have, you realize you have at hand, and you become so empowered. And I find this question very relevant around debates on racism, sexism, classism, and all of these other forms of isms that suppress us, that divide us, that suffocate us. I think we become dangerous if we thoroughly understand how these systems work, but also have a thorough understanding of the fact that we have and can take the courage to do things differently despite.
There's one phrase in your book which I like very much, which I think I will remember always, because for me this was really an eye-opener. This is the phrase where you say that you no longer want to speak in order to explain yourself, but you want to speak in order to be. Can you explain that?
Well, I think this is an urge, a desire that can be a lifelong journey. So I don't claim to have the answer to this. But, originally I wanted to write about silencing. So originally this was going to be a book about silence. And I wanted to, using the examples of Turkish immigrants to Germany, describe how from generation to generation, silencing has been continuing. First generation was seen as silent because they did not speak the language of the majority. Second generation spoke the language, but they were not close enough to the microphones. Third generation speaks the language fluently, speaks into microphones, but nevertheless, they are still silent in the way that they are not allowed to speak on the topics they want to speak about, from the perspective they want to inhabit, but are forced to a very specific and narrow role on very specific topics that they are deemed to talk about. And that this is a continuation of silencing, that despite the fact that words leave our mouths, we are not truly speaking. To use another example, all these, you probably have this very same debates in the Netherlands as well, when you have debates around representation and diversity and multi-perspectivity. And one image that has frequently been used is the image of the table and to have a seat at the table. Mm-hmm. I realized that, yes, my voice was somewhere around this language and words were leaving my mouth in proximity to this table, but I was not sitting at the table. I was lying on the table. I was speaking in reaction to cuts through my skin and flesh and into my bones.
Yeah.
And
so you were always an example of some kind of group of people.
Yes, right. An object. Do they bleed like us? Does that hurt too? And then you, instead of screaming or crying, say, oh yeah, studies have shown that this hurts too, right? So you also hide all your emotions, all of the very natural responses you would normally have if you, in that scenario, were seen as yet another human being. But since you're not, since you are an object, since your survival and existence depends on whether or not how this examination unfolds, you are forced to suppress all of the things that are honest and authentic. And you sort of have to pretend that this is an okay dynamic. And realizing that, I realized I wanted to learn how to speak in a way, write in a way where I wasn't defined by these constraints of society, where I wasn't now voluntarily walking towards this table and you know, taking my clothes off and lying on top of the table because that's the only thing I'm used to, or that I don't constrain myself to the topics that are from outside society, from within society, seen as what I was supposed to talk about. And to go to these very early stages of differentiation of what we are allowed to speak about, or when we are encouraged to speak and when we are pushed back on, it's a lifelong process. But to me, it has had a lot to do with learning how to be truly curious again, and trying to strip myself off the many layers of what was deemed my responsibility.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for the beautiful questions, and also many, many thanks for opening this academic year with this book. It's an honor and it's a privilege, and I hope that every person involved in this process will experience the beauty of coming to the borders of your perception and knowledge and be thrilled by the newness, the beauty, the nuanced facetedness of the world that is unfolding when you step to the borders of what you know, what there is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.